Hello, everybody. My name is Jonas Goldman, and I'll be presenting our team's findings in agroforestry through the titled The Branching Out, Incentives and Disincentives to Agroforestry. Before I begin, I'd like to give a huge thank you to the team. This has truly been a joint effort, as well as to our faculty advisor, Professor Rosen, as well as to WRI for working with us. So what I'm going to overview with this presentation is specifically what agroforestry is and why the World Resource Institute is so interested in it, some of the scope of the World Resource Institute's work, what our project is and how it fits into this work, some of our findings of our project, and then bring it back to how our project's findings fit into the frame of sustainable development. So, nations throughout the world have degraded the ability of their land to provide key ecological goods and services through forms of land-intensive development that are reducing their natural capital's ability to provide ecological goods and services. This is happening to the tune of 5 to 10 million hectares a year, leaving 23% of Earth's terrestrial surface in a degraded state ecologically. Agroforestry is so interesting because it offers an alternative in that you can have land that provides economic development opportunities while maintaining a higher ecological capacity. This compared to many existent forms of land-intensive development, such as monoculture agriculture. And I mention monoculture agriculture in particular because at its heart, agroforestry is a refutation of monocultural practices. It refers to something that indigenous civilizations have engaged in throughout history, where tree species and agricultural crops are cultivated together. For instance, with timber species and edible tree species such as fruit and cacao and coffee, interspersed with ground crops in Mexico. However, there are examples in Western Europe, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa. And among the known benefits that indigenous peoples have reaped from these systems and that we hope to emulate are that intermixing the presence of tree and ground crop species can improve nutrient cycling, soil quality, water retention. In some cases, trees can even act as a windbreak to prevent the erosion of soil. Not only that, but agroforestry provides income diversification for farmers. It recognizes the value of indigenous knowledge and its contribution to society, and improves food security of communities by diversifying their crop suite grown. But this sort of still asks the question, why is the World Resource Institute interested in what is fundamentally just mixing a few plant species together? Well, the World Resource Institute is a think tank with a presence in over 60 countries, headquartered in Washington, D.C. Its role is to advise nations on how they can pursue sustainable development while maintaining the capacity of their natural capital. One major research plank of the World Resource Institute efforts is to advise nations on specifically that, maintaining their natural capital through something called the Global Restoration Initiative, which is the goal is to bring 500 million hectares of currently degraded land to a more ecologically sustainable state. And this is why WRI has expressed such interest in agroforestry, as it is a form of land use that can provide for economic development while maintaining a high degree of ecological goods and services. Because of WRI's interest in agroforestry, our project was built around improving the Institute's working knowledge of the field, specifically what existing policies related to agroforestry found in different nations can either improve or harm the uptake of agroforestry practices. And we looked at existing policy in the cases of India, Brazil, and Mexico. Why these three countries? Well, because WRI already has research teams on the ground there, and WRI asked us to contribute by helping to identify their finding and bring them up to a broader level so their information can be accessed by the wider WRI NGO and decision makers outside of the national context. And help identify, and we did this sort of by overviewing experts in the country, overviewing databases, and government documents on national policies that impact agroforestry. And once we took these findings, we put them within a framework to identify these sort of broader commonalities between policy in different national contexts. And we divided them into incentives, perverse incentives, and disincentives. Incentives are very straightforward. They're mechanisms that promote the uptake of agroforestry, either by strengthening the rule of law, for instance, by certifying the punishments for negative agricultural techniques, or providing economic funding to agroforestry practices. Then there are perverse incentives, which are well-intentioned policy that still has a negative impact on the uptake of agroforestry. And finally, there are disincentives, which are existing policies that can harm the uptake of agroforestry. For instance, providing fertilizer to monoculture agricultural operations, thus disincentivizing farmers from transitioning their fields. So what are some of the incentives that we identified? Well, there is policies that provide training to agricultural producers for providing them the knowledge that they may lack to transition their fields to an agroforestry makeup. There are policies that provide financial incentives, direct contributions from the government to agricultural producers. In Mexico, this takes the form of Sembrado Vida, where the government is directly financing agricultural producers to adopt agroforestry methods. There's the provision of agroforestry inputs, policies that provide seeds and seedlings for farmers to engage in these practices. There is the policies that increase local engagement, allowing for a feedback mechanism between local stakeholders and wider levels of government to make policies more suited to the local context where they will be implemented. And finally, there is access to markets. Policies that increase the size and the demand for agroforestry products. You see differences in this, for instance, in Brazil, with something called the PNAE program, which is the government program that buys locally produced food in Brazil for the nation's school system. And while this has benefited agroforestry, it has not developed the market to a large enough extent to really incentivize the transition of these practices, versus if you look at the case of India, where you have a very extensive and developed timber market, as rural households get most of their domestic energy needs met through the burning of timber products, thus very much incentivizing farmers to transition to agroforestry methods to get that revenue stream. So what are then some of the disincentives and perverse incentives to agroforestry? Well, there is excessive regulation. For instance, in the case of India, there are older colonial era statutes that forbid the sale of timber products between provinces, thus reducing the size of the market for these products. Is lack of access to credit. In Brazil, this is a significant issue, as farmers don't have the credit they need to make that initial capital-intensive push to agroforestry methods, buying the trees necessary. There is incompatible equipment. In India, many tractors are only geared towards monoculture agriculture, meaning if farmers transition their fields, these sort of capital-heavy investments become a sunk cost and somewhat useless. There's the inadequate inclusion of local input. Again, looking at Sembrado Vida, the types of crops and trees farmers must grow to be eligible for the scheme are picked by the central government. Without inclusion of local feedback, this can often lead to species being picked that don't grow well in the farmer's local context, or the farmers don't know how to grow, thus disincentivizing the farmer's transition to these systems of agriculture. And finally, there's the insufficient inclusion of women and other marginalized groups. And this really varies on the national context and the history of culture, misogyny, and just what the nation's current state is like. For instance, in India, there has been a greater push to include female agricultural producers in agricultural plans. However, the effort to include landless, marginalized workers is less developed. So this really depends on the country context. So what did identifying these policies, incentives, and disincentives do? Well, it allowed us to take the in-team's country research findings and break them out of the information silos of the individual countries, allowing us to identify cross-country similarities and best practices in the uptake of agroforestry. We hope this will improve WRI's working knowledge of the field and benefit them when they consult with national decision makers so that they can better develop the practice of agroforestry in their respective countries and bring more land to an ecologically sustainable state.